security guard drew on her, unaware she was an FBI tactical commander. Shock followed instantly. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, spilling golden light over a suburban neighborhood that seemed pulled from the pages of a real estate brochure. Each house looked nearly identical two-story homes with white trim, pastel siding, and porches, adorned with seasonal wreaths. Lawns were clipped to perfection, the kind that suggested silent competitions among neighbors about who could keep their grass the greenest. Flower beds bloomed in careful symmetry, their bright colors standing as proof of long afternoons spent under the sun with gardening gloves and watering cans. The streets themselves felt unusually quiet, muffled beneath the hum of sprinklers and the occasional bark of a dog. Children's bicycles, still tipped on their sides, leaned against driveways, waiting for their owners to return after chasing each other between cul-de-sacs. A gentle breeze rattled through the leaves of oaks and maples, sending long shadows, stretching across the asphalt. On the surface, the neighborhood radiated peace, the kind of calm that people longed for when escaping the chaos of city life. But beneath that carefully cultivated peace was something else. Something less visible, but no less present. It lingered like an invisible thread pulling at the edges of conversation, at the way people glanced over fences or held on just a second too long when locking their doors. Neighbors stood chatting. By their mailboxes, their smiles polite but rigid. A man in a polo shirt leaned against his SUV, his arms folded, as he laughed a little too loudly at a joke his neighbor made. Across the street, a woman pretended to focus on pulling weeds, yet her eyes flickered toward the sound of footsteps that weren't immediately familiar. Even here, where the roses bloomed and the streets were swept clean, there was a quiet current of suspicion, an undercurrent that revealed itself only in those fleeting moments. It wasn't always overt. No one shouted. No one accused, but there was a weight, a heaviness woven into the fabric of the neighborhood, where the idea of belonging was silently questioned, sometimes based not on deeds or character, but on appearance. For those who had lived here long enough, the pattern was unmistakable. New families, especially those who didn't look like the others, were often greeted not with warmth, but with watchful eyes. On this particular afternoon, that unspoken tension hung thicker than the warm air itself. The sun painted the sky in gentle hues of orange and gold, the kind of colors that should have inspired nothing but serenity. And yet, serenity was fragile here, ready to shatter at the smallest provocation. Car drove slowly down the street, its tires crunching against gravel at the curb. Heads turned. Conversations paused for a second before resuming, quieter this time. The neighbors were watching, not overtly, but in the subtle ways people watch when they don't trust what they see. For those who belonged, this neighborhood was a sanctuary, a place to feel safe, a bubble sealed away from the chaos beyond its gates. But for others, for the people who never quite fit the unspoken mold, it could feel like a cage built from suspicion, a place where every action, no matter how ordinary, might be misunderstood. The peace of the neighborhood was, in truth, a fragile illusion. Behind the manicured hedges and the polite greetings, there lingered an atmosphere thick with prejudice, sometimes whispered, sometimes silent, but always there. It was the kind of prejudice that didn't need to be spoken, allowed to be dangerous. It was enough that it existed, simmering under the surface, shaping the way neighbors interacted, the way they judged, the way they feared. And on this warm afternoon, with the sunlight glowing across tidy porches and children's toys scattered across the grass, that silent prejudice was about to find its breaking point. What seemed like the calmest, most ordinary day would soon spiral into something none of them could have predicted. A confrontation that would strip away the illusion of safety and reveal just how thin the veneer of harmony really was. She turned onto the quiet street, just as the afternoon light softened into amber, her car moving at an unhurried pace past rows of identical homes. To anyone watching, it was an unremarkable sight, a black woman in her late 30s, returning from a trip to the store. There was no badge on her chest, no tactical gear strapped across her body, only the easy rhythm of someone winding down at the end of the day. When she stepped out of the vehicle, the first thing that stood out was her composure. Even with both arms weighed down by grocery bags, she carried herself with a quiet confidence. She wore simple athletic wear black leggings, a fitted gray hoodie, and running shoes dusted with the faint trace of the supermarket's parking lot. Her hair was pulled neatly back into a bun, practical and understated, and her face, though relaxed, carried the faint lines of someone used to making difficult decisions. She looked, in every possible way, like any other homeowner returning from errands. And that was precisely how she liked it. Her name was known only to a select few, and for good reason. Beyond these picket fences and manicured lawns, she led a very different life, one built not on garden clubs or block parties, but on precision, resilience, and control under fire. She was a tactical commander for the FBI, a woman who had spent years training teams to move as one under the most hostile conditions. She had been the steady voice in the chaos of hostage situations, the calm presence in the storm of high-stakes raids. Her days were often spent studying blueprints of buildings, mapping contingencies, and preparing men and women to step into danger with clarity of purpose. And yet here, in this quiet neighborhood, none of that mattered. She preferred it that way. Behind her front door, she was not a commander, not an agent, not a strategist holding lives in the balance. She was simply herself, a woman who enjoyed evenings on the porch with a book, who relished the rare moments of stillness between the storms of her work. As she walked up the driveway, the weight of the grocery bags tugged at her arms, but she didn't mind. There was something grounding about this ritual, the simple act of bringing home bread, fruit, milk. For someone whose career demanded constant vigilance, these tasks were her tether to normalcy. The scent of cut grass lingered in the air, mingling with the sweetness of blooming flowers from a neighbor's garden. She let herself take a deep breath, allowing the world to feel ordinary. Ordinary. That was the image she worked hard to protect. She didn't broadcast her job, didn't casually mention her title, and certainly never spoke of the classified operation she'd led. To the neighbors, she was just another homeowner, another face among the cul-de-sac's routines. And she liked it that way, not out of shame, but out of a desire to preserve the one place in her life where she could simply be. But beneath the surface of her calm exterior, there was always an awareness that never left her. Years of training had sharpened her instincts, teaching her to notice details others might miss, the angle of a parked car, the unfamiliar pace of footsteps, the way conversations faltered when she passed by. Her mind was conditioned to calculate risk, to anticipate outcomes, to prepare for what might come. As she shifted the bags in her hands and walked toward her front door, her eyes caught the subtle movements around her. A curtain fell quickly back into place across the street. A neighbor's voice lowered just slightly. None of it surprised her. She knew, though few would admit it aloud, that not everyone saw her as just another homeowner. For some, her very presence raised questions, questions formed not by her behavior, but by the color of her skin. Still, she chose not to let it consume her. She had faced worse than whispers, worse than sideways glances. The weight of prejudice was real, but she refused to carry it as her burden. Here, in this small pocket of suburbia, she carved out her peace in spite of it. The woman balanced the grocery bags and unlocked her door, unaware or perhaps unwilling to dwell on the storm that was already beginning to brew just a few houses away. To the world around her, she was invisible in the way that ordinary people often are, fading into the rhythm of the neighborhood. But in truth, she was anything but ordinary. Behind the plain hoodie and sneakers stood a commander who had stared danger in the eye more times than most could imagine. And soon enough, the neighborhood would find out just how wrong they were about her. The warmth of the afternoon carried a deceptive calm, wrapping the neighborhood in an illusion of order. Neatly trimmed hedges cast sharp shadows on the sidewalks. Sprinklers hissed and clicked across manicured lawns, and children's laughter echoed faintly from a few streets away. But not everyone in the community saw peace. Some carried within them a restless vigilance, a need to enforce rules that no one had asked them to uphold. One such figure emerged just as the woman was pulling her grocery bags from the trunk of her car. The man was in his early 40s, his build sturdy but softened by years of self-indulgence. His eyes were restless, always scanning, as though the neighborhood were a territory under siege and he its last line of defense. He wore a dark uniform pressed slacks, a navy shirt, and a badge stitched onto the chest that at first glance gave him the air of authority. It wasn't police issue. It wasn't military. It was purchased, designed to look official, right down to the tactical belt and steel-toed boots. He called himself the HOA security officer, though everyone knew the role was voluntary. No one had hired him. No one had asked him to patrol. But he patrolled anyway, walking the sidewalks as though they were his beat. Radio clipped to his shoulder, even though no one was listening on the other end. The man thrived on the subtle shift in posture he sometimes saw in neighbors when he approached, the way their smiles stiffened, the way they nodded out of habit. It gave him the illusion of power, the respect he believed he was owed. So when his eyes landed on the black woman unloading groceries, his pace slowed, his chest swelling with self-importance. He didn't notice the ease with which she carried her bags or the faint smile on her face as she balanced them carefully in her arms. He didn't see her as a neighbor who had lived there longer than he had. He saw difference, and difference, to him, spelled danger. His suspicion grew, fed not by evidence but by his own prejudices. He saw the athletic wear she wore, the simple sneakers, the relaxed bun of her hair, and in his mind, these details became codes to decipher, excuses to distrust. What was she doing here? Did she belong? Why hadn't she acknowledged him? He adjusted his belt, making the metal buckle glint in the sun, and walked a slower, more deliberate path toward her driveway. His boots clicked against the pavement, each step measured as though announcing his authority. The woman felt his presence before she saw him. That kind of energy had weight to it, a hovering insistence that pressed against her shoulders. She turned her head slightly, her calm eyes meeting his, and gave a polite nod before turning back to her groceries. But the gesture only fueled him further. In his mind, her composure wasn't respect, it was defiance. He wasn't accustomed to being looked at with such unbothered calm, especially not by someone he had already labeled as an outsider. He circled closer, his shadow stretching long across her driveway. His lips tightened into a thin line as his mind spun with imagined scenarios of heroism, catching a trespasser, confronting a criminal, proving his worth. To him, the woman wasn't just a neighbor carrying her groceries. She was a test. An opportunity. The grocery bag in her hand shifted slightly, a carton of eggs wobbling at the edge, and instinctively she adjusted her grip. The guard's eyes narrowed, interpreting the simple movement as something more. He stopped just short of the property line, shoulders squared, every ounce of him radiating suspicion. To any passerby, the moment might have looked ordinary. A neighbor walking, another neighbor unloading her car. But beneath the surface was tension born not of facts but of assumptions. The man convinced himself he was protecting the neighborhood, protecting the order he believed only he could maintain. But in reality, he was circling like a predator that had already chosen its prey, blind to the truth of who stood before him. And as the late afternoon sun dipped lower, the false sense of authority he wore like armor was about to lead him into a confrontation he could never have predicted, one that would unravel every assumption he thought he knew. The woman balanced the last of her grocery bags on one arm, fishing her keys from her pocket with practiced ease. The day had been long, but ordinary errands, groceries, and now the quiet comfort of home. She slid the key into the lock, the metal clicking softly as it turned. That was when his voice shattered the stillness. "Stop right there." The command rang out like a gunshot, harsh and abrupt, slicing through the peaceful hum of sprinklers and cicadas. She froze, not because she was afraid, but because she knew instinctively that any sudden move would be twisted into justification. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her head toward him. The self-appointed guard stood at the edge of her driveway, his chest puffed out, hand hovering too close to the holster, strapped awkwardly at his hip. His face was flushed, sweat glistening at his temples despite the mild afternoon. "This isn't your house," he barked. "You don't live here. Show me some identification." For a beat, silence stretched between them, heavy and sharp. She blinked at him, her voice calm but firm. "This is my house," the guard scoffed, his suspicion hardening into hostility. "Don't lie to me. I know who lives here. I know this neighborhood." His hand twitched near the grip of his holstered weapon, the movement small but unmistakable. The woman straightened, grocery bags still hanging from her arms, her spine lengthening with quiet authority. "I don't need to prove myself to you," she said evenly. "Now step off my property." Her tone, measured, unwavering, did not match what he expected. He was used to intimidation working, to people shrinking under his stare, fumbling apologies even when they had nothing to apologize for. Her steadiness unsettled him, made him double down. "I said, show me ID." He shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of desperation and self-importance. Movement rippled through the street. Curtains shifted, doors creaked open. Neighbors, drawn by the noise, began to peek from behind blinds, from porches, from cracked open garages. Some raised their phones, cameras recording in silence. Others lingered in shadows, unwilling to interfere. But unable to look away, the quiet suburban street, usually a postcard of stillness, had become a stage. And everyone was watching. The woman inhaled slowly, steadying herself, the calm before a storm. She had faced men armed with rifles, stared down suspects who had nothing left to lose, and commanded tactical units in high-stakes operations. Yet, here, in her own driveway, with grocery bags still biting into her palms, she stood accused, her existence reduced to suspicion in the eyes of a man desperate for control. Her gaze flicked to his hand, which hovered just above the weapon, fingers flexing as though itching for an excuse. She felt the air tighten around them, each second stretching longer, the weight of possibility pressing down like a storm cloud about to break. "Put your hand away," she said firmly, her voice low enough to command without provoking. "You're making a mistake." But to him, her refusal to yield was proof of guilt. The narrative had already written itself in his head. He was the protector, she the intruder. His stance widened, his boots planting into the pavement as if anchoring him to a false righteousness. Gasps and murmurs spread through the growing crowd of onlookers. A mother clutched her child closer. A man across the street whispered to his wife, his phone camera trained on the confrontation. The tension was no longer private, it was communal, electric, pulsing through every watcher who knew how quickly this could spiral. The woman's key still dangled in the lock of her front door, gleaming faintly in the sunlight. So close. Home was right there, yet somehow impossibly far. Her pulse was steady, controlled, but beneath her calm exterior ran a current of indignation, sorrow, and fire. She had lived her life mastering composure under pressure, but this was different. This wasn't an armed raid or a tactical standoff. This was her home, her sanctuary, twisted into a battlefield by one man's prejudice. And as the tension reached its peak, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. The peaceful afternoon transformed into a crucible of fear and possibility. Every second pregnant with the question of whether the man's twitching hand would rise higher, whether the suburban quiet would be shattered by violence. The woman balanced the last of her grocery bags on one arm, fishing her keys from her pocket with practiced ease. The day had been long, but ordinary errands, groceries, and now the quiet comfort of home. She slid the key into the lock, the metal clicking softly as it turned. That was when his voice shattered the stillness. "Stop right there." The command rang out like a gunshot, harsh and abrupt, slicing through the peaceful hum of sprinklers and cicadas. She froze, not because she was afraid, but because she knew instinctively that any sudden move would be twisted into justification. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her head toward him. The self-appointed guard stood at the edge of her driveway, his chest puffed out, hand hovering too close to the holster strapped awkwardly at his hip. His face was flushed, sweat glistening at his temples despite the mild afternoon. "This isn't your house," he barked. "You don't live here. Show me some identification." For a beat, silence stretched between them, heavy and sharp. She blinked at him, her voice calm but firm. "This is my house," the guard scoffed, his suspicion hardening into hostility. "Don't lie to me. I know who lives here. I know this neighborhood." His hand twitched near the grip of his holstered weapon, the movement small but unmistakable. The woman straightened, grocery bags still hanging from her arms, her spine lengthening with quiet authority. "I don't need to prove myself to you," she said evenly. "Now step off my property." Her tone, measured, unwavering, did not match what he expected. He was used to intimidation working, to people shrinking under his stare, fumbling apologies even when they had nothing to apologize for. Her steadiness unsettled him, made him double down. "I said, show me ID." He shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of desperation and self-importance. Movement rippled through the street. Curtains shifted, doors creaked open. Neighbors, drawn by the noise, began to peek from behind blinds, from porches, from cracked open garages. Some raised their phones, cameras recording in silence. Others lingered in shadows, unwilling to interfere. But unable to look away, the quiet suburban street, usually a postcard of stillness, had become a stage. And everyone was watching. The woman inhaled slowly, steadying herself, the calm before a storm. She had faced men armed with rifles, stared down suspects who had nothing left to lose, and commanded tactical units in high-stakes operations. Yet, here, in her own driveway, with grocery bags still biting into her palms, she stood accused, her existence reduced to suspicion in the eyes of a man desperate for control. Her gaze flicked to his hand, which hovered just above the weapon, fingers flexing as though itching for an excuse. She felt the air tighten around them, each second stretching longer, the weight of possibility pressing down like a storm cloud about to break. "Put your hand away," she said firmly, her voice low enough to command without provoking. "You're making a mistake." But to him, her refusal to yield was proof of guilt. The narrative had already written itself in his head. He was the protector, she the intruder. His stance widened, his boots planting into the pavement as if anchoring him to a false righteousness. Gasps and murmurs spread through the growing crowd of onlookers. A mother clutched her child closer. A man across the street whispered to his wife, his phone camera trained on the confrontation. The tension was no longer private, it was communal, electric, pulsing through every watcher who knew how quickly this could spiral. The woman's key still dangled in the lock of her front door, gleaming faintly in the sunlight. So close. Home was right there, yet somehow impossibly far. Her pulse was steady, controlled, but beneath her calm exterior ran a current of indignation, sorrow, and fire. She had lived her life mastering composure under pressure. But this was different. This wasn't an armed raid or a tactical standoff. This was her home, her sanctuary, twisted into a battlefield by one man's prejudice. And as the tension reached its peak, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. The peaceful afternoon transformed into a crucible of fear and possibility. Every Second, pregnant with the question of whether the man's twitching hand would rise higher, whether the suburban quiet would be shattered by violence. The silence was suffocating, every second stretched thin as glass. The guard's gun wavered, his arm stiff but trembling, his eyes darting between her face and the crowd gathering behind curtains and camera lenses. The neighborhood was no longer his stage, it had become his trial. The woman did not blink. Her breathing remained steady, chest rising and falling in calm, measured rhythm. She had stood under sniper fire before. She had crouched behind armored shields while bullets ricocheted around her team. Compared to those moments, this was quiet. Dangerous, yes, but familiar. And then she spoke. Her voice was low, firm, the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to command absolute attention. "You're pointing that weapon at the wrong person." The words dropped like stone into water, rippling through the street, through the guard's fragile facade of authority. He froze, not because he believed her, not yet, but because something in the way she said it carried a weight he could not name. Slowly, with deliberate care, she moved one hand toward her pocket. Not rushed, not jerky, but with the steady composure of someone who knew how to de-escalate a man with a twitching finger on a trigger. "Don't," the guard barked, his voice cracking. His gun trembled higher, but she ignored the panic in his tone. "I'm reaching for my wallet," she said calmly. "And you're going to want to see what's inside." The crowd held its breath as her fingers slipped into her pocket and withdrew a slim, worn leather case. She opened it with a practiced flick. The first thing visible was a driver's license, ordinary, mundane, proof of residence. Proof that she belonged here, as much as anyone else on this manicured block. But she tilted the case further, and that was when the sunlight caught on polished metal and embossed lettering. An FBI badge. Gasps broke from the porches and windows. A collective shock surged through the neighborhood. Someone whispered, "Oh, my God." Another, recording on a phone, muttered, "She's FBI?" The shift was immediate, judgment evaporating, replaced with awe, disbelief, even shame. The woman did not look at them. Her gaze remained locked on the guard, who blinked as though his reality had been yanked out from under him. His lips moved, but no words came. She stepped closer, her voice even sharper now, the steel of command slipping fully into place. "Special Agent, FBI, Tactical Commander." The title rang through the air, undeniable, heavy with authority that dwarfed his flimsy badge and his store-bought swagger. Her words carried the weight of operations that had dismantled cartels, stopped hostage crises, taken down men who wore real weapons and knew how to use them, led federal strike teams into the most dangerous situations this country has to offer, she continued, her eyes never leaving his. "And you," her tone cut like a blade, "just aimed a gun at me in my own driveway." The guard's arm buckled. His bravado drained like water through a sieve. Sweat beaded at his temple as his hand, once raised with such certainty, faltered. The barrel of his weapon sagged downward, unsteady, until finally it pointed to the ground. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice small, all trace of command stripped away. "That's the problem," she replied coldly. "You didn't. No, and you didn't care." The neighbors who moments ago had watched in silence now exchanged uneasy glances. Some shifted with guilt. Others stood transfixed, unable to reconcile their earlier assumptions with the truth shining on that badge. The guard swallowed hard, his chest heaving, his authority unraveling before their eyes. He lowered the weapon fully, his hand shaking so badly now it looked as though he might drop it altogether. The swagger was gone. The self-styled protector of the block had been reduced to a man caught naked in his arrogance, trembling in front of the very person he had tried to diminish. She let the silence hang, ensuring every neighbor absorbed the image, not of her as a suspect, not as an outsider, but as the highest-ranking professional many of them would ever encounter. Then, Slowly, she closed the badge case and slid it back into her pocket. Her groceries still waited on the pavement, quiet reminders of how ordinary her day was meant to have been. Her gaze softened, but only slightly. "This is my home," she said, her voice carrying to every porch and window. "And I shouldn't have to prove that to anyone." The truth of it landed heavier than any weapon. The guard could only nod, his face pale, his authority dissolved. In the shadow of hers, the crowd stood stunned, the unspoken prejudice that had hummed beneath the surface, now dragged out into the open, exposed for all to see. And in the center of it all stood the woman poised, unbroken, and finally seen for who she truly was. The neighborhood remained still, the air thick with the echoes of the confrontation that had just unfolded. The guard, once brimming with self-assured swagger, now slumped against the edge of the sidewalk, hands hanging loosely at his sides, the weight of his humiliation and fear pressing down upon him. He no longer had words to muster, no facade of authority to uphold. The reality of his recklessness had stripped him bare. The woman stood a few steps back from her front door, her posture composed yet commanding. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gloat. There was no need for theatrics, no need to humiliate a man whose own actions had already unveiled the truth. Her power was not in domination. It was in control, calm and absolute. With a measured tone, she addressed him. "You have crossed the line. Misuse of authority and reckless behavior carry consequences. And now you will face them through the proper channels." Her words were precise, deliberate, leaving no room for negotiation or misunderstanding. She held his gaze, steady and unwavering, letting the weight of her experience settle upon him. The guard's knees wobbled slightly as he nodded, swallowing hard. He was a man accustomed to posturing, to imagining himself as the protector of his little world. But here, in the presence of someone who had seen real danger, who had made life or death decisions countless times over, he had no ground to stand on. The badge on her chest might have been symbolic in the eyes of strangers, but her presence radiated authority earned through years of skill, discipline, and courage. Around them, the neighborhood had begun to breathe again, though uneasily. Windows opened slightly, curtains pulled back, and the occasional cautious whisper passed through the streets. The spectators' neighbors who had earlier assumed the role of passive observers now looked at her differently. Their eyes reflected a mix of awe, respect, and a tinge of guilt. They had stayed silent, hidden behind blinds and partially open doors, yet they now understood the magnitude of what had just occurred on their own street. She turned her attention briefly to them, her voice carrying softly to the edges of the lawns. "What you see before you is not what you think. This is not a matter of intimidation or of appearances. It is about responsibility, integrity, and respecting boundaries, both legal and moral." Her calmness cut through the lingering tension like sunlight through mist. The guard, still pale and shaken, finally lowered his gaze, realizing the gravity of the lesson he had learned, not from punishment, not from fear, but from the undeniable presence of someone whose strength was measured in composure, intelligence, and courage rather than in threats or bluster. She didn't need to assert dominance. Her professionalism alone had rewritten the narrative. With deliberate movements, she retrieved her groceries, placing them gently on her doorstep. Each step back into her home was a quiet reclaiming of space, of authority, of her day-to-day life that had been momentarily disrupted by someone else's assumptions. She locked the door behind her, but the statement she had made, the boundary she had reinforced, would linger far longer in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The neighbors watched, some shifting uncomfortably, realizing their own judgments had been shallow, their assumptions unjust. The woman, who had always blended into the neighborhood with casual grace, suddenly seemed monumental in stature. The ordinary resident they had overlooked, the neighbor they might have dismissed with a nod or a passing glance, had revealed herself as someone far stronger, braver, and more disciplined than they had ever imagined. In the quiet that followed, the neighborhood began to settle. Cars moved slowly down the streets. Children cautiously peeked from behind curtains, and a few daring souls returned to their lawns, glancing her way with newfound respect. Conversations resumed, but there was a subtle shift in tone or recognition. That appearances could be deceiving, and that true strength was often hidden behind calm, measured actions. Inside her home, she exhaled a gentle sigh of release. The incident had ended without violence, without humiliation, without chaos. Justice had not required spectacle. It had required patience, skill, and composure. In the end, the lesson lingered not only for the guard, but for the entire neighborhood. Integrity, courage, and professionalism command more respect than intimidation ever could. And in that quiet suburban street, the ordinary had been transformed into something extraordinary, proof that strength often resides where it is least expected, and that those underestimated can quietly, decisively rewrite the story around them. The sun had begun its slow descent, bathing the quiet suburban neighborhood in golden light that softened the edges of manicured lawns and pastel-colored homes. The earlier tension, thick as smoke, had begun to dissipate, replaced by a reflective hush that settled over the street like a blanket. What had seemed like an ordinary afternoon had transformed into a moment that would linger in memory for years to come. A lesson written not in raised voices or violent confrontation, but in calm, deliberate actions. Neighbors who had peered from windows but balanced nervously on porches, or filmed the encounter on their phones, now stood in thoughtful silence. Their whispers had vanished, replaced by an understanding that the incident was far more than a mere dispute over identity or belonging. It was a vivid illustration of how prejudice, assumptions, and the misuse of authority could escalate situations unnecessarily, turning mundane interactions into potential crises. At the center of it all stood the woman, her presence serene, yet undeniably powerful. She did not gloat over the guard's humiliation. She did not revel in his visible fear. Instead, she had exercised restraint, professionalism, and a profound command of her own composure. By doing so, she had not only protected herself, but also reminded everyone watching that true strength is measured not by intimidation, threats, or appearances, but by discipline, integrity, and the courage to act decisively when it matters most. Guard, once a figure of feigned authority, now shuffled along the sidewalk. His posture collapsed, his confidence shattered. He had wielded his weapon under assumptions and bias, believing that his uniform and position granted him power. Yet he had confronted someone whose calm and competence rendered his intimidation meaningless. The encounter demonstrated in stark terms the dangers of placing trust in appearances and assumptions over understanding and evidence. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself had subtly shifted. The children, once rushed inside by panicked parents, now tentatively peeked through blinds or from behind fences. They saw not a threat, but a lesson in courage and dignity. Parents exchanged quiet nods, an unspoken acknowledgement that assumptions and fear could have had far graver consequences. Respect, they realized, is not commanded through bluster or threats. It is earned through actions grounded in skill, integrity, and moral courage. As the woman returned to her front door, retrieving her groceries with steady hands, the symbolism of her actions was not lost on those around her. She had faced a potentially dangerous situation without losing composure, and in doing so, she had asserted her authority in the most effective way possible, through calm, deliberate, and professional action. In every movement, every measured word, she demonstrated that the quietest person, someone underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed, often holds the greatest power. The incident served as a powerful reminder to the community that safety does not arise from suspicion or the arbitrary enforcement of self-appointed rules. True security stems from respect for one another, understanding of boundaries, and the courage to act ethically, even when provoked. The woman's actions illustrated this vividly. She protected herself and her neighbors not with fear or aggression, but through measured discipline and unwavering integrity. By the time the street began to return to its usual rhythm, the hum of sprinklers, the distant laughter of children, the occasional bark of a dog, the lesson had already been absorbed. The neighborhood had witnessed a quiet demonstration of extraordinary strength, one that left an indelible impression on everyone who had seen it. The guards' misguided assumptions had nearly sparked disaster, but the woman's calm authority had transformed potential chaos into a teachable moment for the entire community. And in that soft evening light, as shadows lengthened and doors closed gently behind residents, one truth became unmistakably clear. Appearances can deceive, prejudice can endanger, but composure, courage, and moral integrity, qualities often found in the most unassuming individuals, are what truly protect a community. The woman had not just defended herself. She had reshaped the neighborhood's understanding of strength, respect, and responsibility, leaving an enduring legacy that would quietly resonate in every home for years to come. In the end, the quietest person on the block, the neighbor everyone thought they knew, had shown them all what it truly means to wield power responsibly, with grace, and with unwavering courage.